Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Prime Minister's Questions is coming up in a few moments, and of course we're going to be joined by our political editor Laura Kuenssberg too. There is what, let me look at, about 7 minutes to go to Prime Minister's Questions. Isabel, what do you think Mr Corbyn will go on today? It's been a while. This is the first Prime Minister's Questions since the party conference season. Seems quite a long while ago that it started with the Lib Dems. Not many people noticed that, but it did start with them.
Nice week off for some people, I think.
Very well. What do you think he'll go with on to Mrs May?
Well, it would be quite effective for him to go on her claim that austerity is over, because he could contrast that claim with what's actually going on in terms of the delivery of public services, particularly universal credit, and actually ask her, are you going to end austerity for this programme? Are you going to start funding, for instance, departments like the Ministry of Justice, which are in complete crisis? And he can ridicule that claim, basically. And given that Philip Hammond appears to have been bounced into that claim as well, that austerity.
You think he was bounced into it? He did look a bit shocked.
Yes, and lots of cabinet ministers looked.
A bit like Gordon Brown when Tony Blair said, "We'll reach the European level of funding for the health service."
Yes, one of those sort of nice surprise announcements. But you saw cabinet ministers looking absolutely delighted because they thought, finally, I can go back to the Treasury and say, give me all this money for my department, which is on its knees in various areas. And it would be very wise of Jeremy Corbyn to highlight the ways in which some government departments are really struggling.
That would be a good thing to do, wouldn't it? Because the Prime Minister announces austerity is over, but without any indication of what that really means. So a leader of the opposition who's got a strong track record on these issues anyway, would be a good idea to probe what it actually means.
Look, insofar as anybody's listening to PMQs, I think that beyond the political class, what is important is that, you mentioned Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown makes an intervention today in the Daily Mirror. You know, there are 4 million children in this country living in poverty, most of them with a working parent or a disabled parent. And, you know, at the time when, you know, I think around this table we've all kind of want an end to Brexit because we want to try and get on to solving some of these problems. And I'm absolutely certain that Corbyn and the front bench and many backbenchers will be wanting to talk to the government about this derailed disaster of Ian Duncan Smith's making, which they were warned about again and again. Universal credit is destroying the lives and quality of lives of millions of people. That's what I would like to see the front benches of both parties talk about.
Well, we shall see. There's only a few minutes to go. Watching Prime Minister's Questions with us today will be the Treasury Minister, Mel Stride, and the Shadow Treasury Minister. You see, perfect balance here. Annalise Dodds, they've now joined us. Good to see you. Of course, Laura Kuenssberg is now with us as well. Laura, what's the word? Is austerity the open goal?
Well, it is an open goal for Jeremy Corbyn, of course it is, because I think would be diplomatic to say it was a rather cheeky use of rhetoric from the Prime Minister last week to claim that austerity was over. Of course, if you look between the lines of what she was actually saying, what she was indicating was that at next year's spending review, jargon, but that will be when the huge decisions about public spending and who gets what in the years to come will be taken. Actually, the government, by that point, will be looking to ease off the tightness of the spending taps a little bit. That's, of course, what's actually going on in government, and Philip Hammond was apparently brought into that, but it'd be interesting to see what the Minister, Mel Stride, says on that. But for Jeremy Corbyn to contrast that rhetoric with the reality of what is going on for many people in the country, for many councils in the country, for many people who are caught up in universal credit, would be a classic Corbyn attack that probably would be pretty effective. That said, before the conference season, actually, Jeremy Corbyn started focusing on Brexit, something he'd stayed away from a long time. And, you know, don't forget, the talks are in the absolute crunch moments right now.
They certainly are.
They really are.
Another crunch moment.
Absolutely, but this one does really, really matter.
Yeah, because the timetable
so many times.
is there.
But the other thing is that Westminster is pretty much out the loop. There are really only a few dozen people who know what's really going on.
Does that include us?
Well, of course it doesn't include me, Andrew.
No, I think it does. That's why we ask you these questions.
There are officials who are trying to thrash this all out behind closed doors. They then come back to Westminster and report back to the government. But there is a very great extent that there is a great truth in there's so much noise in Westminster about Brexit, but the actual decisions about what is going on are being taken by a handful of people and not those people who will be speaking in the Commons today.
We have a Treasury Minister with us, so let's ask him. Are you preparing for a post-austerity world?
Well, we are ready with a strong economy that has grown for 20 successive quarters, has the highest level of employment in our history, lowest level of unemployment since the mid-1970s. And what the Prime Minister has rightly signalled is we're now in a position to do more in terms of, for example, freezing fuel duty that we've just announced.
You've always done that. You did that through austerity.
Well, we've done it for 8 years at great cost.
Yeah.
We're now saying we'll do it for a 9th year, but we're also saying that the public sector pay cap, we've loosened off on that.
You've already done that.
We've already made an announcement. Well, there'll be a lot more to come in the
So that's where I'm asking. I mean, we've had the particular broadcast in favour of the Tory economy. What's the answer to my question? Is the Treasury now preparing for a post-austerity world?
We are preparing for a spending review in which we will still be fiscally
Yeah, but you were planning to do that anyway.
But at the same time, Andrew, there are a number of things out there that we have already said, not least our huge commitment to the National Health Service, an extra £84 billion over the next 5 years, where what we're saying is that we have got our economy into a good place. There is more that we can do. Clearly, the detail of that is not something I would have speculate on your show.
No, and I wouldn't even ask you, but let me try something simpler. Can I get the phrase post-austerity world to utter from your lips or not?
Well, in what context do you want me to say post-austerity?
Just say we are now, we take the Prime Minister at her word to the Tory conference, and we're moving now into a post-austerity world. Would it be possible for you to say that or not?
What we are saying is that we have gone from inheriting an economy in 2010...
No, you've said that endlessly.
No, well, I haven't actually said it. But
no, you've said it. Your party has said we get the story, we know your story. Well, I'm trying to look forward, not back.
I'm simply trying to answer your question, which is that the position that we're in now is different to that which we have been in the past, in the sense that we have now reduced the deficit by 80%. We have a strong economy, we have a growing economy, we have record levels of employment.
So no need for more austerity?
And therefore, come the spending review next year, we will be in a position to be able to do more, given the hard work of the British people and of this government in turning the situation around.
Well, during PMQs, we're going to have our very own fact-checker, Joel, fact-check Joel, as we call him. He's in the newsroom. There he is. He's going to check out anything that comes up in Prime Minister's questions, and we can... He is alive, I promise you. We're going to also move him to Madame Tussauds, where he will be there on Thursdays, but on Wednesdays he has to be here. Regardless of the Minister trying to avoid answering the question straightforwardly, if the government moves on to a situation where it is able to spend more, it is able to spend more on health, which is already indicated, it may be able to spend more on other issues, not as much as your party says it would, but doesn't that take the edge off your attack on the government's economic record?
Well, no, because we've had those 8 wasted years, and actually austerity has not delivered that stronger economy. In fact, today we saw that GDP figures have actually been just revised down. What we've had is a slower level of GDP
what was the
GDP
quarter on quarter, the 3 months to the end of August compared to the previous 3 months?
Yeah, so related to projections, it's down from what we'd heard before. We found it is compared to what the OBI projected.
How much did GDP grow in the 3 months to the end of September?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Oh, you're just talking about it. You should know that.
Yes, but I looked at the figures early this morning and I saw that
it grew by 0.7%.
Right, but
now,
that's
it is
lower,
true that
Andrew.
actually it's not lower than projections. It is true it flatlined in August, but it grew by 0.7%. You talk about 8 wasted years. How many jobs were created in these 8 wasted years?
I'm not going to say it's a bad thing that we've had additional employment.
You call them wasted years.
It has been wasted years because when we compare Britain to other comparable economies, we're the only country of our type, an industrialised nation in the G7, where we've seen growth but living standards stagnating, where we've seen our levels of investment growth, productivity growth and GDP growth all growing more slowly, that being less than where it should be. Our recovery after the financial crisis in the UK has been slower than that in the US after their
in the
great
past
crash.
8 years, we've grown more slowly than France?
We have, in absolute terms, probably not, but in relative terms, when we look particularly...
We've grown more slowly than Italy?
Sorry, in relative terms, are you sure?
Yeah. Have we grown more slowly than Italy?
I would anticipate probably not.
Have we grown more slowly than Spain?
OK, can I ask you a question, Andrew? Is there any other country you can think of where living standards have stagnated to the extent that they have, like the UK? Is there any other country that you can name where you've had GDP growth?
I could, but I've just been saved by the Speaker. Because we're going over to PMQs. First time I thought I'd ever say we've been saved by the Speaker, but we are. Let's go.
I, along with other members of this House, will be watching a parade of 120 members of the British Army into Parliament. They're representing the breadth of the 50,000 regular and reserve Army personnel. This is an opportunity for us to thank them for their tireless work to keep our country safe. This afternoon, Mr. Speaker, I will be hosting a reception for World Mental Health Day. I'm delighted that this week the UK hosted the first ever Global Ministerial Summit on Mental Health, with a landmark agreement to achieve equity for mental health. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, the Polish community have long made a valuable contribution to Scottish society. My Polish constituent is a young man who's lived in Scotland since he was 6. Yet when he applied for job seekers allowance last month, he failed the habitual residency test. Even the DWP cannot understand the Kafka-esque letter he's been sent. Like the Windrush scandal, is this the shape of things to come for EU citizens in the United Kingdom?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady, as she knows, first of all, as part of the negotiations with the European Union, we have already come to agreements about the rights that will be available to those EU citizens who are living here in the United Kingdom already. We have set out very clearly what will be the situation for those who come to the United Kingdom during the implementation period. And I also was able to update people a few weeks ago to make clear that in a no-deal arrangement as well, we will also ensure that we look after those EU citizens who have come here and made their home here. As for the individual case, I'm sure that the Department for Work and Pensions will be looking into this in some detail.
Mrs. Pauline Latham.
What steps is the government taking to encourage more tourists to enjoy the performing arts outside of London?
Can I first of all thank my honourable friend for highlighting the issue of performing arts, and that there are some great performing arts to be seen around the country. But she's also a performing arts ambassador, so I congratulate on her work on that. And we're committed to supporting the UK's tourism industry and spreading the wealth it produces across the country, we set out in our tourism action plan. But we are providing funding for the performing arts throughout the country. That includes investing £78 million in a new theatre and arts complex, the Factory, which is a home for Manchester International Festival. That will encourage international collaborations, investment and visitors, and £5 million in the redevelopment of Colston Hall, the South West's major concert venue, to make it fit for the 21st century. Performing arts being encouraged around the whole country.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will join me in expressing our deepest sympathies to the people of Sulawesi in Indonesia following the earthquake and tsunami in which 1,500 people have died. We obviously wish them well on their rebuilding of their communities, and could we also take this opportunity to thank all those officers and ratings from the Royal Navy who did so much to help during the emergency at that time. Mr. Speaker, today is World Mental Health Day. And today, there are 5,000 fewer mental health nurses than there were in 2010. The Prime Minister said last week that austerity is over. When will austerity be over for the mental health services?
First of all, can I join the right honourable gentleman in expressing our condolences to those who were affected and our thoughts with all those who were affected by what happened in Indonesia. I'm pleased to say that obviously the Department for International Development was able to respond to that. I understand that the DEC appeal is now up to £10 million as well, and as the Right Honourable Gentleman said, obviously we were able to put support in kind in through the support that was available from our armed forces and indeed from others, and I commend all those who have been working so hard in that area. Now, he raises the issue of mental health, and I'm pleased he's raised the issue of mental health, because this is a government that is actually ensuring that mental health is given the attention that it needs. It is this government that has ensured that there will be parity of esteem for mental health and physical health in the National Health Service, and it is this government that is putting record levels of funding into mental health. But I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, if he's saying to me, do we still need to do more on mental health? And I say, yes, we do. That is exactly why we are setting out further steps today, particularly to improve the mental health of children and young people. But also I'm very pleased that my honourable friend, the member for Thurrock, is taking on the responsibility as the Minister for Suicide Prevention, the first time a government has had a minister appointed to such a post. This government takes mental health seriously. That's why we're putting record levels of funding into mental health.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, it was a Labour amendment to the Health and Social Care Act that put parity of esteem on the face of the legislation. It was opposed by her government. And if she thinks that mental health spending is going well, then maybe she should have told the Health Secretary this, because this morning he said it's still way off where we need to be. The Royal College of Psychiatrists has found that income of mental health trusts in England was lower than it was 6 years ago, and children are being sent as much as 300 miles away for urgent treatment. It needs urgent action now. Mr. Speaker, people in every village, town and city know that violent crime is rising. 21,000 police officers have been cut. 7,000 police and community support officers have gone. When will austerity be over for the police?
First of all, in relation to the mental health issue, I've just said that I think there is more for us to do on mental health. And as part of our long-term plan for the National Health Service, we will be doing more for mental health. And I might remind the Right Honourable Gentleman that our plans for the National Health Service will see £394 million more a week going into our National Health Service. He asked me about the issue of policing, and of course, what we have seen is this government has made, including the precept on council tax, has made £460 million more available for policing in this current year. And if he's so concerned about funding for policing, why did the Labour Party oppose that extra money?
Mr. Speaker, if austerity is over for the police, then it doesn't seem that she's told the Police Federation about this, because they are currently taking the government to court for failing to implement the decision of the independent pay review body. Our dedicated police officers and PCSOs deserve better than they get from this government. In the last year, Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last year, the Education Secretary has been rebuked 4 times by the Statistics Watchdog for making false claims about education funding. I know the Prime Minister is a stickler for accuracy, so given her commitment to ending austerity, can she confirm that austerity is now over for all teachers who will receive the independently recommended 3.5% pay rise?
I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that as regards the issue of policing, and he talked about the Police Pay Award, in fact this award does represent the highest consolidated pay award since 2010. Now he then goes on to talk about He then goes on to talk about funding for schools and what is happening in relation to schools. He knows the announcement that has been made in relation to the Teachers' Pay Award, but I might just remind him that school funding this year is at a record high, with the extra 1.3 billion. With the extra 1.3 billion we've put in this year and next, per pupil funding is being protected in real terms. I recognise the pressures that schools are under, but I also recognise that we now see 1.9 million more children in good and outstanding schools compared to 2010. And part of that is because of the reforms we've put forward into education, including the free schools and academies, which the Labour Party would abolish.
Jeremy Corbyn! Speaker, the reality is that over half of teachers are getting another real terms pay cut next year. They've been subject to 8 years of pay freezes and pay rises capped below inflation. It's no wonder there's a chronic shortage of teachers, and the government has again failed to hit its recruitment target for new teachers. Yeah. The Conservative leader of Northamptonshire said, and I quote, "They couldn't cope with the levels of cuts." The Conservative leader of Somerset says, "I feel abandoned. There are no solutions coming." So will the Prime Minister listen to her own council leaders and end austerity as she promised last week?
Well, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, first of all, in relation to teachers in our schools. In fact, there are more teachers in our schools now, and we see more people applying to be teachers. And I recognise the very hard work that our teachers put in and day out, and the good results that our children are getting are a result of their hard work and the hard work of their teachers. He refers to Northamptonshire County Council. Of course, the independent inspection was clear that failures at the council were not due to a lack of funding. We have backed councils. We have backed councils in England. Between 2015 and 2020, £200 billion are available to deliver the local services that their communities want to see. So we're going to see an increase of £1.3 billion in the money available to councils over the next 2 years. Extra money was announced at the conference at our party conference in relation to social care, and councils have access to over £9.6 billion of dedicated funding in relation to this. And there's a 31 million increase for rural services. Yes, we have had to make tough decisions, and yes, councils have been asked to make tough decisions. The reason we had to do that, was because of the reason we had to do that was because of the state of the public finances and the economy we were left by the Labour government. People have made sacrifices, and they need to know that their hard work has paid off. And yes, better times are ahead under a Conservative government.
It might be a good idea, Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister took a few minutes out of a very busy day to listen to some teachers and the stress they're going through, and the number of newly qualified teachers that feel they cannot carry on anymore and leave the profession that they love. The National Audit Office has found that local government funding from central government has been cut by 49% since 2010. And next year, government funding for councils is going to be cut by a further £1.3 billion. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that 75% of the social security cuts announced in 2015 have yet to come into effect. £2.7 billion will be cut from working age benefits next year alone. Can the Prime Minister confirm this swinging austerity on the lowest paid and the disabled people in our society will now end, as she said last week?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that what we see in the changes that we're putting forward in relation to welfare reform is encouraging people into work and making sure that when they get into work, work pays. And I might also say to him that there are £2.4 billion of unclaimed benefits under the legacy system of the Labour Party. that will be paid to people under universal credit. 700,000 people getting the benefits they're entitled to under universal credit for the future. And he asks me about what this government is doing in relation to the end of austerity. And I've been very clear that there are better times ahead for people. We will see debt falling, and we will see support for our public services going up. Austerity is being brought to an end. What is not being brought to an end is fiscal responsibility.
Mr. Speaker, the poorest third of households will lose £745 a year if these cuts go ahead. Just this week, and the Prime Minister should listen to them, the Equality and Human Rights Commission has reported the situation facing those with disabilities has got worse and their rights are being violated in our society. 8 years of painful austerity. Poverty is up. Homelessness and deaths on our street is up. Living standards down. Public services slashed. And 1 million elderly are not getting the care they need. Wages have been eroded. And all the while, Mr. Speaker, all the while, billions were found for tax giveaways for big corporations and the super rich. The Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister declared she is ending austerity. But unless the budget halts the cuts, increases funding to public services, gives our public servants a decent pay rise, then isn't the claim that austerity is over simply a great big Conservative con?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, actually wages are going up. We've increased the national living wage as well. There are 1 million fewer people in absolute poverty under this government. Under universal credit, 1 million disabled households will get around £110 a month more as a result of being on use of universal credit. And he talks about cuts. I'll tell him about some cuts that have been of benefit to working people in this country. What about the £18.5 billion of income tax cuts that have helped household incomes under this government? What about the cuts that those in their household bills that 11 million households will see as a result of our energy price cut? And what about the 46 billion of cuts through freezing fuel duty that has made a real difference to people's lives? But we know what would really hurt working people. Labour's plans would cost £1 trillion, £1,000 billion of people's money. Uncontrolled borrowing, spiralling taxes, working people paying the price of Labour. Yet again, Labour taking us back to square one.
As always, I'm determined to find plenty of time for backbenchers. Mr. Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know my right honourable friend recognises how important it is that every child has the opportunity of the best start in life. For the last 3 years, I've been campaigning to ensure that summer-born and premature children have that opportunity. The DFE's recent report contains some statistical oddities, and progress seems to have stalled. Would my right honourable friend agree to meet with me and some parents to discuss this matter?
Well, thank you. Can I say thanks to my honourable friend for raising what is, I know, an important issue for many parents. And we are concerned that some summer-born and prematurely born children whose parents choose to delay their entry to school until compulsory school age may be missing the essential teaching in a reception year. I understand the DFE is looking at how best to make changes without creating unintended consequences elsewhere in the system, and it's important that they look at it in that sense. And I know that the Minister from the Department will be very happy to meet with my honourable friend to discuss this.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you well know, today is World Mental Health Awareness Day, and I want to congratulate the Prime Minister on her appointment of a Minister for Suicide Prevention. Indeed, in Scotland, we have our own Minister for Mental Health and look forward to working closely with the new UK Minister in this important issue. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that we must all work to eradicate policies and circumstances that lead to people that believe that suicide is their only option.
Well, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, I think it is right that we take this issue of suicide as seriously as we have done. Particularly, there have been obviously concerns raised about the number of young men who commit suicide. And it is important. Obviously, people in a range of different circumstances find themselves are in a position where they think about committing suicide. We must do everything that we can to ensure that people are prevented from committing suicide and that the support is given to people in those circumstances.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that the Prime Minister agrees with me because, as reported by The Independent, nearly 1 in every 2 women taking part in the UK Government's Work Capability Assessment say they have attempted suicide after or during the process. A series of secret internal inquiries into these reveal that Conservative ministers were repeatedly warned of the policy's shortcomings. Will the Prime Minister commit today to ensuring that her new Minister of Suicide looks at the impact of her government's own social security policies and at long last, Prime Minister, scrap the appalling Work Capability Assessment?
Yes. Well, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, first of all, of course, these were assessments that were introduced by previous government. It is important that we get these. It is important that we get these assessments right. I think it is right that we are encouraging people into the workplace and wanting to ensure that those people are in the workplace, who are able to be in the workplace, are given the support to enable them to do that. That is what we want to do. I think it is right that we maintain assessments. Of course, we look at the impact of those assessments. We look at the quality of those assessments. That's work that the DWP does on a regular basis. But I think it is important that we are undertaking those assessments.
Colin Rake. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown and Head of the Financial Conduct Authority Andrew Bailey have joined the All-Party Group for Fair Business Banking's calls for action against the bankers who cost the UK taxpayers trillions of pounds throughout the financial crisis, none of whom have been fined, banned or prosecuted, despite clear evidence and guilt of fraud and malpractice. Would my right honourable friend do all she can to urge and enable regulators and our crime agencies to hold those responsible to account?
Well, if I can give my honourable friend the assurance that since the financial crisis, of course, we have been looking at that regulatory system. We've designed, ensured that we've built one of the most robust regulatory systems in the world. It is designed specifically to ensure financial stability and to protect taxpayers. Now, there are a number of measures that we've introduced in relation to the responsibility of those at the top in organisations. In 2016, we brought into force the Senior Managers and Certification regime to hold those at the top personally responsible for wrongdoing. Legislation was also introduced alongside this regime, which ensures bosses whose reckless misconduct causes their institution to fail face up to 7 years in prison. And while, of course, these reforms are very recent and it will take further time before we see the full impact of these reforms, I can say that last year we did see the FCA issuing total fines of £229 million against individuals and firms who'd broken FCA's rules. But if I can reassure my honourable friend that we will, of course, continue to remain focused on ensuring that we do build a fair and more balanced banking system and looking, if there is more that needs to be done, at what we should be doing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with her Work and Pensions Secretary that half of lone parents and around 2/3 of working-age couples with children under universal credit will lose the equivalent of £2,400 a year? And if we are to believe the Prime Minister's promise to end austerity, will she promise today to reverse the £3 billion worth of cuts that are built into the universal credit rollout?
Well, can I say to the right honourable lady that in relation to those people who are being moved on to universal credit as part of the managed migration, we are, of course, undertaking that. That will start later next year. It will be done on initially on a small-scale basis to ensure that we get that right. But we are putting protections in, transitional protections in for those people. So people who are moved onto universal credit as part of that process will not see any reduction in there. They will be protected.
Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last week, Access Community Trust, working in conjunction with other Lowestoft voluntary groups and Waveney District Council, launched the Fin-Ice project, which will provide emergency accommodation for the homeless, not just during the period of below zero nighttime temperatures, but for the whole winter period from 1st November to 28 February. On World Homeless Day, will the Prime Minister build on the rough sleeping strategy and provide a long-term funding system so that charities such as Access Community Trust and St Mungo's can put in place bespoke initiatives that prevent homelessness before anyone actually has to sleep rough?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this issue, because we don't want to see anybody having to sleep on the streets. That's why we have committed to ensuring that we end rough sleeping by 2027, halve it by 2022. It's why we're supporting various projects around the country to do this. I recognise the point that he makes about the local authorities, their involvement in this, their need to build capacity and capability in their teams to ensure that they're able to deal with this, and the role that the voluntary sector can play in this as well. We're investing over £3 million a year with the voluntary sector groups to train and advise local authority teams to be able to address these issues. We want to ensure that rough sleeping becomes a thing of the past.
Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation and the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations are jointly lobbying Parliament today. They ask for a very simple undertaking from the Prime Minister, namely that in negotiating the Brexit deal, she will not trade away the right to fish in UK waters. Will the Prime Minister give our fishermen that undertaking?
Well, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, I absolutely recognise the importance of the fishing industry, which it plays across the UK, but particularly in Scotland. And can I reassure him that as we're going through these negotiations, we've been very clear that once the EU rules no longer apply to the United Kingdom, we will be an independent coastal state, and we will be making those decisions. We will be controlling access to our own waters, and we will be seeking to gain a fairer share of quotas.
Henry Smith.
Mr. Speaker, in 2005, the then Labour government closed accident and emergency at Crawley Hospital. I'm delighted that my right honourable friend has committed to additional resources for the National Health Service, including part of the Brexit dividend. Can I get an assurance that the upcoming NHS plan will include a return of local services at its heart?
Yes. Can I say to my honourable friend that absolutely I can give that assurance. Obviously, the long-term plan for the National Health Service is being developed by the National Health Service in conjunction with clinicians and people at a local level. But it's absolutely clear that we need to ensure that we recognise the importance that those community services provide. And as my honourable friend says, it is this government that is not only putting in place a long-term plan to support the National Health Service, but also that longer-term funding for the National Health Service, which will see the biggest cash boost ever in the history of the National Health Service.
Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Modern slavery is a scourge on our society, affecting thousands of victims, including Jan, who was living in an attic in Oldham and forced to work without any pay by his gangmasters for 6 years. Will the PM join me in congratulating the work of businesses like the Co-op Group, who offer paid work placements to help victims rebuild their lives? But can the Prime Minister also explain why then it's taken the government 5 months to get round to recruiting the anti-slavery commissioner's post?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that I think, as he will know, modern slavery is an issue which I have taken a particular interest in and worked on particularly, and I'm proud of the impact that our Modern Slavery Act is having. But sadly, we do see people being effectively enslaved, continuing to be effectively enslaved in this country. We're seeing more cases where people are being prosecuted, the criminals are being prosecuted, but we do need to ensure that the support is available. I certainly commend I think it was the Co-op that he referenced, and other businesses who are working to help people who've been the victims of modern slavery. My right honourable friend, the International Development Secretary, tells me that when she chaired a session at UNGA in relation to modern slavery, this question of the role of the private sector was one that was particularly given a prominence, and we will continue to do all we can to ensure we're dealing with the issue of modern slavery.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, it's obvious that the biggest task facing the Prime Minister this winter is firstly to obtain a compromise agreement with the other 27 European governments on the terms of our withdrawal, and then to win the approval of this House, a majority in this House, for that same agreement or something like it in a meaningful vote on the terms of our departure. Does she equally accept that the maths makes it obvious that that majority can only be obtained if the agreement retains the support of the pro-European Conservative backbenchers in this House and also wins the support of a significant number of Labour backbenchers, pro-European backbenchers, on the other side of the House, which would reveal that the hardline Eurosceptic views of the Bennites on the Labour front bench and the right-wing nationalists in our party are a minority in this Parliament. Will she therefore proceed courageously on that basis in the formidable task that lies ahead of her?
I simply say to my right honourable and learned friend, what we are working to is to ensure that we get a good agreement for the United Kingdom, an agreement which delivers on the vote that the people took in the referendum to leave the European Union, to bring an end to the jurisdiction of the European Court, to bring an end to free movement, to bring an end to sending vast sums of money every year to the European Union, that does it in a way that protects jobs, that ensures no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I would hope that when we come back, we're working for that deal. When we come back with a deal, I would hope that everybody across this whole House will put the national interest first, that everybody across this whole House will look not only at a good deal for the future of the United Kingdom, but will also remember that having given the decision as to whether we stay in the European Union or not to the British people having voted to leave, it is our duty to ensure that we leave.
Your grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday we marked the start of Baby Loss Awareness Week. Oliver Gill was 24 weeks old when he lost his life to cancer on Christmas Day 2010. Since then, his parents Andy and Jennifer, through the charity Love Oliver, have raised well in excess of £500,000 to fund research into childhood cancers and to provide much-needed emotional and practical support for families affected by these terrible illnesses. The Prime Minister will know, having met them in 2016, what a remarkable couple they are. Will she join with me today in thanking them for all that they have done and continue to do?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, it's very good of him to raise this issue. And also, I would like to pay tribute to other members across this House who have put a clear emphasis on this issue and ensured that in Baby Loss Awareness Week and outside Baby Loss Awareness Week, we recognise the tragedies that sadly take place, and the circumstances for too many families in this country. And I'm very happy to pay tribute to his constituents and the amazing work that they have done in raising the funds that he has referred to. This is something we don't want to see anybody having to face and having to deal with, but that out of such a terrible tragedy has come the good of that fundraising which can help others. I hope that his constituents are proud of what they've done.
James Heapy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Somerset, we've been working for years to pay down the huge debts left by the Lib Dems when they last ran House, meaning many essential services are now having their funding withdrawn. Will the Prime Minister meet with me and Somerset colleagues to discuss this challenge, and will she look favourably on our bid to fully retain business rates from April 2019?
Can I say to my honourable friend that obviously I understand that the issue around the business rates and the bids that he's referred to from Somerset and others are being currently looked at and being assessed, and a decision will be announced alongside the local government finance settlement later this year. I'm sure that the Minister in MHCLG will be willing to meet with my honourable friend and others to discuss this further. I can say to my honourable friend that I have already received representations from a Somerset Member of Parliament on this particular issue, and I think it's. But I'm sure MHCLG ministers will be happy to sit down and discuss the details with my honourable friend.
Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the national debt after the crisis of the banks stood at £768 billion. Now that the Tories have been in 10 years, albeit 5 years with the wishy-washy Liberals, can the Prime Minister tell the House what the debt is today?
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman, he raises the issue of debt, and it's an important issue to raise. What this government is doing is seeing that we will actually, doesn't need to ask me the question if he's got the figure already. What this government is doing is ensuring that debt is going to fall. And what we crucially have seen is a reduction in our deficit of 3/4 sitting under this Conservative government. But the honourable gentleman shouldn't look quite so pleased with himself when he starts to think about what a Labour government would do to our debt in the future, which is take us back to that.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, the 120 soldiers who will march into the north door of Westminster Hall straight after PMQs are actually representing the 3,000 who are currently deployed in 28 different countries around the world. And I'm delighted the Prime Minister, and I hope colleagues from across the House and staff from around the Palace will be there to welcome them and to thank them for all they do. But will they also at that time remember two lots of people? First, the families without whose support their deployment would not be possible. Second, those who are returning from overseas injured both mentally and physically. And thirdly, those comrades who will never return.
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that he puts his point extremely well. Of course, we are proud of everything that our servicemen and women do, and we will be pleased, I and other members of this House will be pleased to welcome those servicemen and women and to give that thanks to them in the way that we can here in this House. But he is absolutely right. We should never forget the families of those servicemen and women, and we should ensure that we are supporting those families. We should also recognise the importance of supporting those who do return with injuries. Some of those injuries, of course, physical and some mental, and ensuring that we recognise both physical and mental injuries is important. And we should never forget those who have laid down their lives for our freedom and for our security.
Thank you. I'm sure the whole House will have been horrified at the sight of mothers feeding their chicks with plastic to death because of the tons of waste that we pump into our oceans every day. We must take urgent action on this. But our waste system is broken. Will the Prime Minister commit today to working with me to stop this tide?
She's raised a very important issue. This question of plastics is one which the government is taking extremely seriously. As she will know, we have measures in our 25-year environment plan in relation to elimination, a pledge to eliminate all avoidable plastic waste, microbeads and straws, for example. There are shortcomings in the current regulations around plastic recycling and how we incentivise better design of packaging and material choices, and we'll be consulting later this year on our proposals. And of course, we will look at any ideas that come from members of this House as to how we can ensure that we are dealing with this scourge of plastic.
Taunton Dean has just won an award for her commendable work on speech and language services, so she should be a celebrated denizen of the House. Rebecca Powell.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. The question actually isn't, I'll save a question about that for later, but this question, Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister will know, the Agriculture Bill comes to the Chamber today, and it's a great opportunity to rethink our land use policy and the way we run everything about our land. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it demonstrates that this government is leading the way on supporting a sustainable, biodiverse environment, supporting our farmers and food producers and our rural communities, especially those in Taunton Dean?
Well, I congratulate my honourable friend and commend her for all the work that she does on issues relating to the environment. She's absolutely right. Leaving the European Union, leaving the Common Agricultural Policy, enables us to take another look at our support for farmers and their use of the land, and to ensure that as we do that, we are looking at issues such as the impact on the environment, and that we're able to ensure that we do see not just that sustainable environment and biodiversity that my honourable friend has referred to, but also that we are a generation that leaves the planet in a better state than we found it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have heard this week that the world is facing ecological and human disaster from climate change, and that radical transport reforms are vital for our future. Will the Prime Minister therefore give her personal support to the proposed GB Freight Route Rail scheme, which would take some 5 million lorry journeys off our roads each year, cutting thousands of tonnes of CO2 and other emissions, which are contributing to global warming and poisoning the air we breathe?
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that he makes a very important point about the need for us to ensure that we're getting freight off our roads and onto the railways. There are real benefits for doing that, both for the environment but also in relation to congestion. And of course we are investing more money in the strategic freight network. I will have to look into the specific proposal that he has raised, but I can assure him that the principle of ensuring that we're encouraging freight onto our rail and off our roads is a good one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the House will have heard the Japanese Prime Minister say that Britain would be welcomed into the TPP with open arms. Does the Prime Minister agree that post-Brexit it would be wonderful if our country could meet Japan's embrace?
Can I say to my honourable friend that I was obviously I've spoken to the Japanese Prime Minister about this issue, as I have spoken to other Prime Ministers of countries involved in the CPTPP. I'm very pleased that they want to welcome us into that trade agreement with open arms, and we stand ready to do exactly that.
It was Karen Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, a judge was unable to make a secure accommodation order for a young man involved in gangs with psychiatric problems and at serious risk of harm. The judge said an opportunity to help him and keep him safe was lost. Like many colleagues, I am dismayed, frustrated and outraged, and deeply worried that we will have blood on our hands. On World Mental Health Day, will the Prime Minister guarantee that she will investigate this case, make sure action is taken, and guarantee no other vulnerable children will be left in such a terrible situation in future?
I'm sure we're all concerned by the particular case that the Honourable Lady raises. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, will be happy to meet the Honourable Lady to discuss that particular case and to look at the issues that it raises. We do want to ensure that support is available there for vulnerable people, particularly for vulnerable young people. As I say, my right honourable friend will be happy to meet her to discuss it.
Mr. Speaker, the effect of the recent tsunami, earthquake and volcano at Palu in Indonesia's Sulawesi Islands has been devastating, and the welcome response from our Embassy and International Development Department includes 2 RAF A400M aircraft and supplies and a team of humanitarian workers out there now. Teman yang membantu saat dibutuhkan adalah teman sebenarnya. A friend in need is a friend indeed. Would my right honourable friend join me in sending our condolences to President Jokowi, our thanks to British citizens and JCB for their help, and would she encourage DFID to do even more, including matching the funding from the DEC Indonesia tsunami appeal?
Can I say to my honourable friend that he has raised, again, this very important issue which was referred to by the Leader of the Opposition earlier on. And of course our condolences go to all those who have lost loved ones in this terrible disaster that has taken place, and to those who have been affected in whatever way by this disaster. We commend all those who've been working there to bring support, to bring aid, to bring help to those who were affected, and recognise the significant contribution that has been made by British volunteers, British companies and by our armed forces. And the Department for International Development has already made some commitments in relation to the matching funding of the money that DEC is raising, but will of course be continuing to look at what support it can give.
It's 1:45. We leave Prime Minister's questions. The Prime Minister responding to a question there on the Indonesian tsunami tragedy. As we predicted, the Leader of the Opposition went on an austerity theme there. All the questions were related to that. Laura, what did you make of it?
Well, I think it was a pretty effective attack from Jeremy Corbyn, building up that theme. Is austerity over in the police? Is austerity over in the schools? And he went through sector by sector. A pretty effective attack on safe ground for him, though. I think we didn't learn very much other than the Prime Minister's speech last week. That claim that austerity is coming to an end has given Jeremy Corbyn quite an effective new attack line. But what we should also absolutely say to our viewers is don't expect very many changes of that in the budget in a few weeks' time, because remember, the Prime Minister was trying to set out a political signal about what will happen in next year's spending review if Brexit doesn't go pop.
Well, what we've learned there and earlier on this programme is that the government may well have declared that austerity is coming to an end, but it hasn't thought out a narrative to replace that. It hasn't thought out, OK, it's clear what the line of attack will be. That was predictable. We predicted it from Mr Corbyn. But they haven't worked out how they should respond to that.
No, and Theresa May tried to clarify the austerity is over line towards the end of the exchanges at PMQs by saying that the era of fiscal restraint hasn't come to an end, that actually the government's still going to be responsible. And you can just hear that line trotted out to every Secretary of State, as we mentioned earlier, who turns up at the Treasury going, can you fund this project, please? Can you fund local government a bit better, for instance? But it was just striking how many backbenchers, Caroline Flint, for instance, a Labour MP, who raised, again, the end of austerity while talking about universal credit. And that's a matter that is really worrying Tory MPs as well as Labour.
There is a really interesting thing going on here that Theresa May was trying to put forward last week. If you talk to people in Number 10 about what they're really trying to suggest here, is that by next year, towards the end of next year, they might be in a position, and I stress might be in a position, to be able to start shifting the pendulum back from cutting, shrinking the state, to doing something different and shifting it back in the other way. Now, it's not clear if the Treasury, and oh look, we have a Treasury Minister here, are entirely comfortable with that approach, but it is worth noting, if they manage to get through the battering of the next few months, that is the direction that Theresa May wants to try to take. Now, it may completely be for the birds, and we know from many of our viewers and many MPs in the Chamber that experiences of what the impact of cuts in the last few years have got on strike, you know, are a very, very, very different way to that kind of hope. But from a political point of view, Number 10 does want to set out some kind of way. They do want to be trying to move that pendulum back the way.
But the Prime Minister did say that the end of austerity didn't mean the end of fiscal constraint. And I think it's one of the government's of fiscal targets that although overall debt doesn't come down, it comes down as a percentage of GDP. It would follow, I suggest, from simple arithmetic, that if the GDP is growing by, say, 1.5%, public spending cannot grow, or borrowing cannot grow, by more than 1.5%.
So we have made it clear, and the Prime Minister made it clear in her speech to party conference, that we would hold to debt as a percentage of GDP continuing to decline. I think
it's
that's
only
very
just
important.
started.
Well, that's an important comparison with where Labour would be, where it would be going up through.
But it also means you can't increase public spending by more than the growth rate of the economy, correct?
You've got growth, you've got tax receipts, and tax receipts have actually been doing fairly well more recently. So it will be a case in next year when we have the spending review to look at all those issues, making sure we are fiscally responsible, whilst at the same time acknowledging the fact that a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of sorting out the deficit, which is now down by 80% since 2010, is reflected in a more optimistic upbeat move.
But if your target, and I don't, if your target is to reduce debt as a percentage of GDP, that is a fiscal constraint on you, isn't it?
Yes, of course.
And that will limit what is meant by the end of austerity.
Well, clearly, what we are not therefore saying is that we are going to go out and irresponsibly turn on the spending.
No, I know. I'm just trying to put some parameters
what the Labour Party will do
on that.
So
is it Labour's policy to ensure that overall debt as a percentage of GDP falls?
So it's our policy to not be paying for current spending and consumption through debt. We have a fiscal credibility rule that says that over the parliamentary period that we shouldn't have debt overhanging at the end of that. But where it's necessary, in particular to fund investment, which of course we've seen really struggling in the UK, we think that that should be funded through the public sector. But I just want to come back on one thing, if it's OK. We've been talking about fiscal constraints. Now, there's one group of people who has not been subject to that fiscal constraint, and that's the very highest earners who've seen their income tax cut under this government, and also profitable companies where we've seen corporation tax cut. That has not resulted in the increase in investment that government said it would. So fiscal constraint for some.
Right, but let me come back to this issue. Are you saying that a Labour government would balance current spending with its tax revenue?
Over the parliamentary period, yes, we would want that in relation to consumption spend. We don't think it's sensible to look at investment spending. So when you're paying for people delivering health services, for example, when you're paying for staff. But instead,
so nurses pay, teachers pay, welfare benefits, other parts of the social spending, doctors pay. All of that would, under Labour, have to be financed out of taxation, not borrowing.
Well, indeed, and we've set that out, actually, exactly how we would do that at the last general election, through reversing some of the tax cuts that we've had from this government. But we think that there is that investment gap for the long run, particularly in
I understand on the investment front. Is there any social spending that you wouldn't agree to?
Well, there absolutely is. In fact, I think it's quite interesting at the last conference period that it was only Labour really that was saying how we would achieve cost savings that are necessary, for example, in education. We've got a huge amount of money going into supply teacher arrangements at the moment. We had our education secretary saying actually there's a much more efficient way to do this that would save the public sector lots of money.
Is there any proposals for extra social spending that you wouldn't approve of?
Absolutely, if they're not effective and appropriate ones, absolutely. Of course there would be. Well, if they're not ones that are going to have good outcomes for people that aren't sustainable, of course we wouldn't approve them. But we want to look for efficiencies as well, and this government doesn't seem to be doing that.
Every government talks about efficiencies.
But we've set out what they would be already.
Right. Let's, well...
Some of them.
Yeah, some of them, exactly. Let's go to fact check. Joel, because I think you've been looking at education spending. Joel.
That's right, Andrew. So at PMQs, as we heard, Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May clashed over the issue of schools funding. This is what the Prime Minister said. School funding this year is at a record high. Per pupil funding is being protected in real terms. Now, schools funding may be at a record high in terms of the overall level of schools funding, but that's because the number of pupils has been going up under this government, and the amount of money that goes into the school system overall is linked to the total number of pupils. I've been speaking to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and they published a big report looking at all this last month, and in that report they said this: total school spending per pupil has fallen by 8% in real terms under this government. So that's looking, as I say, in terms of the amount of money going to each pupil, per pupil schools funding. Now, Theresa May also said that per pupil funding is being protected. That is true in terms of the current financial year, but again, I was speaking to the IFS and they said that in the last financial year, 2017-18, there was a cut of 1.2% in the amount of money that each school gets for each pupil, and in the year before, 2016-17, there was a cut of 2.7% in that per pupil funding.
All right, Joe, fact check, thank you for that. So, Minister, the situation is that over 8 years, per pupil spending in real terms has fallen by 8%. It was 4% in the past 3 years. All you're doing now is you're baking that cut in and simply saying it won't get any worse. That's the government's position.
Well, if you look at the amount we're spending on education compared to a number of years ago, it is substantially higher. If you look at the amount we're spending on education compared to a number of international comparators, we are right up there.
Oh, these international comparators include private school
Japan
fees
and places like this.
They include tuition fees.
Pupil funding.
The point is, I'm talking about per pupil funding. You cut it by 8%, and you're simply freezing it at that level.
The fact check on that statement by the Prime Minister was correct, actually, because
it's down by 8%.
In this year, it has been protected. So
frozen.
Protected for whatever you.
After an 8% cut.
Your assertion is that the Prime Minister was saying something where actually she should have been talking about a cut.
No. What I'm saying is that it's not going down this year in real terms. It's not going down next year in real terms, according to the Treasury papers.
So
but that's on the back of an 8% cut.
Right.
You're not reversing that cut.
But the fact check was on what the Prime Minister said about per pupil funding at the moment and going forward, and she was right.
And you accept it's gone down by 8% in real terms under
I
your
haven't
government.
read the IFS's report, and so I can't comment
It's based on you. It's based on Treasury figures.
Well, what we are saying is that both the amount per pupil is being protected going forward, and we also have 1.9 million more children going through good and outstanding schools. So it's not even all. It's about outputs rather than all about the money. Actually.
All right. How much did per pupil spending? How much did per pupil spending go down in real terms in the last financial year, the year ending April of this year?
I don't have a figure for that.
1.2%. It went down again after the 8 years. I want to bring Paul in. I've got one final question for you, though, Minister. You accept that mental health is labour-intensive, that it takes a lot of manpower to look after people with mental health issues? Yep. Are you sure?
Well, it clearly takes human input.
So why are there 5,000 fewer mental health nurses now than when you came to power?
OK. Going forward, and we've made some important statements about this, we are going to be investing in the National Health Service.
But why have you cut by 8,000?
Which Simon Stevens welcomed. And as part of his welcoming that additional funding, he specifically referenced that it would help with mental health care. So we will be in a position going forward to do more than we are at the moment.
After cutting 5,000, Paul, I'm going to give you the final word here. I'm slightly surprised that one of the issues that the Leader of the Opposition didn't go for is the continued cuts in working tax credits, because the real problem is the working poor. And they're not very well paid, and their tax credits, their welfare payments, meant to give them a decent wage, are being cut as well by billions.
I mean, I thought you saw Caroline Flint going quite hard on the whole universal, because universal credit also applies to the working poor. But I thought that, you know, for the Conservatives, I'd just say, get used to this. If you're going to say better times are coming, you have to be able to say to Britain's nurses, police personnel, soldiers, you know, local council workers, how better it's going to be and how quickly. Because, you know, so that 49% cut in local government funding that wasn't disputed by the front bench, by the Tory front bench, is what is making life fall apart in many of our towns. And you know, those questions from Corbyn will be clipped up and out there, if not by Labour, then by Momentum, on social media to millions of people by tonight. This is not an irrelevant issue anymore. And, you know, if you haven't got an answer of what are you going to do, who are you going to tax, where's the money coming from, to invest in our country, you haven't got a proposition to the people. And that's what she found out. She was floundering all over the place today with some technocratic answers, staring at her own feet. That's the future for the Tory party, unless they get a clear answer to how you get better times to come to this country.
30-second final thought, Laura?
Well, I think Paul's right. If Brexit proceeds as smoothly as the Prime Minister hopes it does, which may well be a hope in vain, that is a glimpse of a more normalised politics that we may well return to after the spring. Remember, though, the Tories have already accepted that they may well have to put taxes up. I know the Treasury won't give us a definitive answer on that yet, but that may well be part of what they're going to have to put forward. We shall see. We're back to tax and spend. But Brexit hasn't gone away. That's it for today. Bye-bye.
That's all, folks.